Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. This is Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra nuggets and tidbits to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. And we are going to look at Dell's data that he provides to us on a daily basis. This workbook is linked in every video I produce, although actually it's been missing from a few of them recently. It's just disappeared for some reason. But going forward, it'll definitely be on every video. This is free for you guys to check out. He does a great job every day and then occasionally does big analyses, and we're going to go through the comparison between the Bakhmut losses and the Avdiivka losses. I've just had I've just given him a call, a little tinkle, to see if I definitely understood some of the things he was talking about, or the ways he presented the data, and hopefully I've got a good handle on what I'm going to talk about. So what you're looking at the moment is the personnel losses, and these personnel losses obviously go up, they never go down, and so that's why the blue line, which is the total losses, will continue going up as the war goes on. The steeper that line is, the steeper the gradient. So here you can see a steep gradient, and over here it's marginally steeper. That's because the losses are higher. So the higher these losses, as you can see in the red daily totals there, the steeper the blue line. So we can see that the beginning, well, just to give you an intro into this, if you haven't seen this before, I've done these a number of times. But and remember, there is a huge caveat here. The caveat is that these are general staff figures from the Ukrainians. Do we know how accurate they are? We're not sure. Propaganda's involved, inaccuracies, so on and so forth. So I'm assuming these are 100% accurate. Of course, they might not be. I do spend a lot of time trying to justify that they are at least somewhat accurate with all the work I do in my first video of the day. And I do genuinely believe that these are fairly accurate. That my biggest concern would be actually in this sheet, the personnel, and how many are dead, how many are wounded, whether it includes wounded. There was so many claims at the beginning that was entirely dead. I don't think many people, well, there are some who believe that they have killed 400,000 people now. I think that's unlikely. I think that's going to include severely wounded, which is why it went from liquidated personnel to personnel. That's just my thoughts. You guys can disagree with me. Anyway, generally, I think they're accurate. So the story of the war is, at the beginning of the war, there weren't any pitched battles, really. The Russians came into Ukraine with all this equipment, expecting a 2-day, 3-day special military operation. They got clogged up in the mud. They got stuck in big columns, and then the Ukrainians hit them with Bayraktar TB2 drones and other munitions, and they lost quite a lot of equipment. But personnel-wise, it wasn't huge losses. Right, the losses came when you started getting things like Bakhmut taking place, when you started getting counter-offensives taking place, like the Kharkiv counter-offensive that took place in August, September, this kind of area, if I remember correctly, and then later the Kherson counter-offensive around here. But this will also be underwritten by losses in Bakhmut as well, because they were staggeringly large losses. And then this time period here will be largely underwritten by activity in Bakhmut that took quite a long time. And then we get to Avdiivka. So you can see Avdiivka has been incredibly costly for the Russians, in terms of their personnel losses, particularly in the October-November time period, and then drops a little bit in January, end of December and January, and then has been ticking up quite a bit in the last few days as the Russians have gone on that full-fledged assault. And of course, that's not just Avdiivka, that is other places as well. Okay, let's move on to tanks now. So the tank story is they lost a lot at the beginning as they're all parked up in these roads, stuck with nowhere to go. But, well, they did have somewhere to go. They're just somewhat unable to get there. And they lost a lot. Then we can see around the Kharkiv counter-offensive, they lost more. And then on into Kherson counter-offensive. And then we move through to the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So these losses here aren't really anything to do with Bakhmut. Bakhmut was interesting because Bakhmut saw very little mechanized equipment used. Wagner predominantly used meat assaults to do their work, or infantry assaults. And that is definitely borne out by the comparative analyses that we'll come to a little later. What these tank losses will be concerning is the Ukrainians, the Malatok Machka back around sort of here, had a bit of, so up to that point, that's going to be general attrition for activity taking place all along the front line. And then around here, the Ukrainians started hitting the Russians with artillery and drones and all sorts, and we got an uptick in first-person view drones happening around here. But the Ukrainians realized that they couldn't do the counter-offensive in the way that they had initially thought, sat back somewhat more, and did a lot of hitting from a distance of the Russian forces. So that's why I think you get this slight uptick here, which is represented by the rolling average of that orange dotted line moving upwards there, and slightly steeper here than we saw over here. So that is moving on towards Avdiivka. And then Avdiivka happened. The Russians attacked Avdiivka. And instead of the Ukrainians attriting the Russian vehicles, tanks here, by attacking the Russians attrited Russian tanks by attacking the Ukrainians. And it was a kind of military harikiri where they just threw themselves on their own swords, or really threw themselves on the artillery that was remaining, the Ukrainian artillery ammunition, and the FPV drones that had been so effective around Avdiivka. And they got an absolute hammering. They got mauled in terms of tank losses here. 55 tanks in one day is absolutely outrageous, 44 in another day. And there are general spikes there as the Russians gather themselves and go again. For the APVs, you can see armoured personnel vehicles. These include infantry fighting vehicles, and I don't know if I can make that any bigger. I don't think I can. Infantry fighting vehicles, mine-resistant ambush protection vehicles, and armoured personnel carriers. And again, they lost quite a large number of those vehicles at the beginning of the war for the reasons I've given. Then you've got Kharkiv and Kherson. Then you've got general war and the counter-offensive, and then you've got Avdiivka going. Here you got 120 losses in one day, 91 in another day. Just some absolutely astronomical losses, consistently higher, and that is why the gradient is much steeper in this part, or at least somewhat steeper in this part of the war. Okay, now on to artillery. Artillery here gives us a slightly different picture, and I'll explain. So you have some, artillery was getting hit as it too was stuck in those columns, and then we had a lot of it being lost in towed and SPGs, self-propelled guns, in the Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensive. And then here, what you had, in my opinion, is an explicit decision of the Ukrainian forces when they lost those vehicles at Tokmachka to go out and attrit. They realized we can't continue attacking. We don't attrit Russian artillery. So we now need to go out and hit artillery. We're going to sit back somewhat. We're still going to prod and probe. But if you remember, they won't go on these full-blooded assaults with combined arms maneuver. They sat back and they spent a lot of time targeting Russian artillery. And that is why you see a consistent, an initial uptick, but a consistent degradation of the Russian artillery here. These are huge losses they took. Often above 40 a day, but very, very often above 20 and 32. So incredibly costly for the Russians. And actually, the Avdiivka time period doesn't see huge amounts of artillery in the same way it sees huge amounts of IFV losses and tank losses, because Avdiivka wasn't a case of Ukraine attriting Russian artillery, because that wasn't coming towards them. It was those vehicles attacking and then just blowing up entire columns that were trying to do those combined arms maneuvers, right? However, there was still artillery being attrited, but I was questioning in these points whether Russia had not come to the end of their artillery, but were less able to replace their artillery pieces that they lost in the way that they previously had been. So I think they lost huge amounts here, but they were able to bring them out of storage so that they could continue to lose huge amounts. And then here, maybe there were just fewer pieces of artillery. But we have seen a few days recently where they have been over 60 lost in a single day, 61 to 66. That is absolutely massive there, and just goes to show the sheer scale of some of these losses for the Russians. But yeah, that tells its own picture too. So we'll move on now to multiple launch rocket systems. It's not, because there are fewer of these, the losses don't tell such a picture. It's, I don't know that there's too much I can glean from that. And that's just the nature of data when you don't have as much stuff to record. I think anti-aircraft warfare systems does tell us a little bit, even though, again, it's not huge amounts of data compared to, say, APVs. So here we saw initially some anti-aircraft warfare systems get taken out, and then with spikes somewhat consistent. But it's again around that point where the Ukrainians sat back and said, right, we can't do our attacks unless we attrit artillery. It was also the same with anti-aircraft warfare pieces. And you see that counteroffensive in May time, suddenly they realized they had to take out air defense systems so that they could operate drones, but actually helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft as well. So that's why you see this period. And I think there is still that need. They know that with F-16s coming, they will need to have basically carried out suppression and destruction of enemy air defences operations. So I think you've consistently seen from May until now the Ukrainians focus on taking out anti-aircraft systems. With regard to aircraft, again, I don't think the data is enough. I mean, the story this tells is right at the beginning they lost a load. And as I said before in previous analyses, that then caused the Russians to be way more cautious. There was loads of fixed-wing aircraft at the beginning of the war, and they started using them much more sparingly and much more cautiously further away from the front lines to protect those valuable airframes. And then you had certain times where they lost airframes when they're trying to push forward more, do a little bit more with them. But actually, there was a large period of time where really the Ukrainians struggled to take out many aircraft at all. It's really frustrating. It would have been great if they'd had ATACMS for months and months and months and would be able to take out huge numbers of airframes. But alas, it was not to be. And we've seen recently some upticks as well as the Patriots have been brought to bear. And in fact, when you have days where they're losing 9, 4, 4, 3, 3, you can imagine that these were the times when Patriots were suddenly brought nearer to the front line and they could, get off a few missiles and take out a number all at once. With the helicopters, I'm not sure they added the helicopters to these lists from the ATACMS strikes on Luhansk and Berdyansk airfields. I don't think they did, and I'm not quite sure why they didn't do that, but the claim was they lost, say, 14 helicopters in one fell swoop. I don't think that's reflected on these figures. There's not enough data really to tell us too much, other than recently helicopters have not been taken out as much. And what does that tell us? Possibly that the Russians haven't been using them as much. They've been a bit more cautious, possibly around the time or after the time that Berdyansk and Luhansk airfields were hit. That was the end of the counteroffensive. So I can't remember exactly when, but it might have been around October. It could be this 6 area. Maybe that's some reflection of the losses. But then you don't see any real losses after that. So the Russians possibly not using them, afraid of having them taken out again. Then we can look at cruise missiles, I think, before drones. I love looking at this because there's a sort of consistency to the way they did use cruise missiles up until sort of March. And then there's a bit of a gap. And you're thinking maybe they have procurement issues with regard to manufacturing them or getting them from Iran. These are basically your larger drones. And then they were used quite a bit around May and June time. But this massive gap here signified either stockpiling. Well, it was stockpiling, but I think that represents that they did not have the production and procurement that they would have liked. Because even you get back to here, and there was a couple of days of huge numbers of these are cruise missiles, huge numbers of missiles here, being sent on a couple of days, but then you're right back down to previous kind of normal numbers, if you like. I just don't think, again, I will say you would if you could, you aren't, so you probably can't. And my belief is that they are firing cruise missiles at the rate they are producing them. So this is a stockpiling here. If you had imagined taking 40 off that 88 and then putting the 40 here, taking a 40 off this one and putting the 40 there, then that gives you your 40 consistently across this time period. And the only reason you had those two very high numbers there is because they were waiting, they were stockpiling them to use them for some particular reason. They wanted to completely overwhelm the Ukrainians. But yeah, again, it just shows that they are using these at a pretty damned consistent rate. I think Andrew Perpetua is talking about like 100 a month, basically 25 a week is what you get, and is what you've consistently got, and is what you can predict they will use as well, all things remaining equal. And it's pretty much a similar story, although there's a lot more data for drones. But I would say, again, they're using drones at the rate they can produce them. Otherwise, you would just see more than we are. If you go back to December, there was a day of 66. If you go back to November, there's a day of 93. We are not seeing that so much at the moment. There was one quite recently that was fairly high. But again, you know, they aren't using them in those consistently high numbers because they don't have them. You can bet your bottom dollar they'd use 93 a day if they could. Every single day. If the Russians could send 93 every single day, they would. So this is fairly obvious rationale to me that they just don't have that amount to use. And of course, that's pretty obvious. They're not going to have 93 a day to 100 of these large drones to fire a day, but they use them at the rate they are procuring them. Right, we have not enough data to make any kind of story about warships, other than from August onwards, I think maritime drones are become a thing. Now, some of these warships were taken out by Storm Shadow missiles and similar, of course, as well. But I think maritime drones are definitely a thorn in the side of the Russians that simply wasn't the case all the way back at the beginning of the war. So while there were some boats lost earlier in the war, and we had the Neptune missile, I think it was, that took out the Moskva, and you had other causes for these losses. I think now maritime drones are going to be a really big component of Russian naval losses, as well as missiles. But if they have moved all their ships to Novorossiysk, then that will be harder for the Ukrainians to affect. Right. With vehicles and fuel tanks, so logistics really, again, at the beginning, lots of fuel tanks taken out and vehicles. And you have your normal sort of Kharkiv counteroffensive, Kherson counteroffensive sort of upticks there, fairly consistent. And then around that counteroffensive, exactly the same approach to attrition. Step back, don't commit our own vehicles. We lost too many in Malatokmachka, so we're now going to trick the Russians. And then when you start hitting Avdiivka, or actually just before Avdiivka, September was pretty difficult for the Russians there. You start seeing these really heavy losses, and they have continued. So actually, the Ukrainians have done a very good job since September of absolutely mauling Russian vehicles. The question is always, are the Russians doing the same to the Ukrainians? Right, of course, that's going to be the case. Special equipment, again, well, what defines special equipment, but very much steeper line going from March onwards. Now, the story this tells me is that up to that point, up to say March of last year, the Russians probably weren't using things like excavators to dig trenches. They were just involved in moving their vehicles into Ukraine. And they also weren't using, I think you've had much more evidence of surveillance and comms equipment, and also electronic warfare equipment. So some of these more funky vehicles, I think, have just come to the fore more the later we've got into the war. So at the beginning of the war, the Russians weren't too interested in using that stuff. They didn't need to dig trenches. They didn't feel they needed to to jam stuff so much and to get surveillance of Ukrainian positions because they were advancing, particularly at the beginning, so quickly into Ukraine. But anyway, that kind of that gives you an understanding there. Right, we're going to have a look at Bakhmut stats and Avdiivka stats, and that's really where we're going today. The main thrust of today, even though that's a big preamble, it's just topping up what I've told you before. Now, what Del has done here is he's looked at Avdiivka, just to explain these stats a little bit. He's looked at the total losses. So there you see the total losses of the Russians. I'll try and make that a little bit bigger so you can see there. Oh, it doesn't like doing that. No, yeah. Okay, so here we have the total losses of personnel, tanks, APVs, and artillery. That's mainly that's just what we're going to look at. And you have all of the days, so that's the whole of the war, up to the 17th of February. So this is 3 days ago, inclusive. So we're missing 18th, 19th, and 20th, but so be it. You get the idea. Now he's then taken the days where Avdiivka happened. So that's October the 5th. He took it. You could argue it's earlier than that, but whatever, it's there or thereabouts. So October the 5th is where Del has said, right, Avdiivka has definitely started. So all the days, then you have the days without Avdiivka, so that's up until October the 5th, and then only Avdiivka is October the 5th until now. And he said, right, so the average losses without Avdiivka, so if we divide the number of days up until the 5th of October and divide that number of days into the total losses, then you will get 476 people dying on average every day. But when it comes to Avdiivka, that goes up to 893. So then he looks at only 5th of October to now, and that's 893 a day. And he says the difference between those two numbers is 417. So although there could be other flashpoints here and there might be other troughs, but essentially we can have a fairly good guess that Avdiivka is costing the Russians, or has costed the Russians, an extra 417 people per day. Now, I've been hearing things recently that they are losing at least 500 people a day for the last, few days. So, that seems to be fairly on point there. Now, when it comes to vehicles, so the green says that is above average. So with vehicles, the daily average was 807 without vehicles, 8.07 without vehicles, 12.73 with vehicles. So losing another 4 per day on average. And then APVs, 15.35, moving to 15.3. So actually pretty much the same, interestingly. But again, what you're doing there, just to give you an understanding, is if we look at APVs, okay, that's to say, well, we can see a big tick here, big uptick there, but there's an uptick there and an uptick there. And actually, when you spread these upticks over the whole of the data set, then actually it looks like what Avdiivka is presently. So Avdiivka has meant a huge uptick in equipment losses. However, that's compared to, like, say, this period, but it doesn't factor in other huge areas of losses at the beginning of the war and in the the Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensives. So I think that's why you get a 0 there, no change. And then in terms of artillery, Avdiivka has shown there to be moving from 11 per day to 22.5 a day. So there's a huge amount of artillery lost during the Avdiivka time. My personal thought is that's probably not a result of Avdiivka. That's probably as a result of what Ukraine are doing all over the front lines in trying really hard since October to hammer the Russian artillery everywhere. In fact, I'd say that's going to be an awful lot to do with Krinky area as well there. So we must not think that everything's to do with Avdiivka, but there's an interesting difference there in the averages. Now, when we go back to personnel, what Dell has then done is saying, right, okay, so here are the total losses that Avdiivka has incurred. And what he's done there is taken the average extra that they've lost every day in the Avdiivka time period and said, well, that's probably as a result of Avdiivka. And then he's multiplied that averaged out number by the number of days that Avdiivka has taken place. So that's from October the 5th to now. And he says that, look, the numbers, and this is going to be death and wounded as far as I'm concerned, are 56,723. That's the extra losses that have occurred above the average since October the 5th. And then he's worked out how many square kilometers Avdiivka is, and he's worked out that equates to 660 people lost per square kilometre, or 1,711 people lost per square mile. And then he's done the same thing with the Bakhmut time period. And he's taken the time before Bakhmut, and he's taken I think 172 days of Bakhmut, and he said, this is how many people were lost in Bakhmut over the previous average. He's not included time after Bakhmut, so the Avdiivka figures aren't included in that. It's actually cut off at the end of. That's what I was asking him about. So actually, this is quite a good comparison. So previous to Bakhmut, there were these losses. Then Bakhmut hit, and there were these losses. And he said, right, okay, sure, there might be losses incurred in other places other than Bakhmut that are going to affect these figures, but from a simplistic point of view, 59,715 people were lost in Bakhmut, although that's over a longer time period, I think, than Avdiivka. And then per square kilometre, that equates to 1,435 people lost per square kilometre, and 3,709 people lost per square mile. So Bakhmut was more costly for the Russians in terms of personnel losses. But when it comes to tank losses, is this tank next? Let's have a look. This is, tanks, APVs, artillery. When it comes to tank losses, it's a massive down trend in terms of what tanks and indeed what APVs were lost during Bakhmut. And again, this goes to the idea that Bakhmut didn't see mechanized equipment much at all. Hardly any IFVs were involved in Bakhmut and APCs and whatnot. It was just these meat assaults that took place. And that's what Dell's data confirms, that it was very much Prigozhin's way of doing war was send in the troops. We're going to go house to house. It's going to be even out on the edges of Bakhmut. We aren't going to use mechanized equipment. It's infantry led, and we have expendable convicts, and we're just going to send them in. Yes, we have our well-trained Wagner as well. We're going to use those in concert, and the end result is that we'll take Bakhmut, and it will cost us an awful lot of people. So it's highly costly in terms of people, as we can see from the stats here. But it didn't cost too much in terms of mechanized equipment. Artillery did cost more, but I think the artillery figures are much more likely to be spread throughout the whole thing, and I don't think you have concentrated artillery usage in these places as much as you do things like mechanized equipment or personnel. So I think that's a really useful bit of data analysis that Dell has given us here, and there's a little bit more he sent me in terms of explanation and what he's found out. So I big thanks to him. I think that's absolutely fantastic to have this data that we can all look at. Now, although he's put this on a nice Word document for me, if you go back to the Excel spreadsheet here, there are two tabs that give you the Bakhmut figures and the Avdiivka figures. So you can look at those yourselves and you can have a little play around with the data. It is in the link to this whole workbook. I think that's really useful. Confirms somewhat, data that we already knew, but it gives us good justification for that. The Avdiivka has been costly in terms of mechanized equipment, and and in terms of troops, but Bakhmut was more costly in terms of troops. And actually, when you average out the whole year or whole 2 years in terms of equipment losses, then actually Avdiivka is about average, even though it is a massive uptick from what we saw in the last, actually pretty much a year. It's only those other high points, consistent high points, that means that those Avdiivka losses are somewhat average, if you get what I'm trying to say. Anyway, hopefully that was of use to you. Thank you so much to Dell. Give him some props in the threads if you want to. Really appreciate him doing that. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.